Alrighty, so good afternoon everyone. Welcome to the webinar, Unpacking the Stage 2 Tenancy Reforms in Queensland. Obviously a very important time for us in Queensland here and for everyone involved in working with people who may be renting or supporting those in our community. And we really appreciate your time and joining us today. I'm just going to start by acknowledging the traditional owners on the lands on which we're meeting here today. So I'm coming to you from Turrbal and Yuggera land. I'd like to pay my respects to elders past and present and acknowledge any First Nations people joining us here today. And as well as acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands that you may be joining us from across this wonderful state in which we live. And as always, acknowledge that this is a very important time for us as a community across Australia in enshrining the voice into our constitution with the Yes campaign thriving and alive currently, and something that QCOSS is very strong in advocating for. So welcome folks, and thank you for joining us. I have the great pleasure of hosting us for this hour that we have together to unpack the Stage 2 tenancy reforms in Queensland. It's a great privilege to welcome Penny Carr, CEO of Tenants Queensland, here with me today. And obviously Tenants Queensland is the leader in supporting renters in Queensland. And it's a real privilege to have Penny's attendance here and to work together with Tenants Queensland in a range of different ways, including, of course, the Make Renting Fair Queensland campaign, very important campaign that we've been a part of for many years now, and one that really brings together the voices of our sector in advocating for fairer rental legislation in Queensland. So this is the rough agenda for what we're going to discuss today. I'm going to give a quick summary of where we've come from in terms of the Stage 1 reforms that some of you may or may not have been involved in over the years. I seem to have memories when I was working in a specialist homeless service in 2011, talking about the just around the corner there were tenancy reforms and the Act was getting reviewed, and that's 12 years ago now. So it's been a long time coming. So I'll quickly summarise those reforms, and then Penny and I'll just have a conversation as we work through the options paper for the Stage 2 reforms, and then there's a discussion there as well around some of the other considerations that aren't identified in the options paper that are still very important subjects to discuss. Now, this is structured as a webinar, and so for those of you joining us as attendees, we really encourage you to pop any questions or comments into the chat, and there's the Q&A function as well, and really keen to respond to as many questions as we can that you may have. Unfortunately, as a webinar, we won't be able to have people discussing too much, but we'll do our best to try and engage with you through the session. And then from here this is being recorded and we'll be promoting it through our networks, because there's still 1 week for the submission window, and it's a real purpose of today is the call to action to increase the number of submissions to be made. So to start with, I want to just touch on Tenants Queensland submission. Now, there's a link there which my colleague Lauren will pop in the chat. I really encourage you to open that, and we'll reference that through some of the conversation of the position that Tenants Queensland has taken, and that's live on their website. Penny, is there anything you want to talk to about that before we move through the agenda?
The only thing I'd say about it, and thanks, I just want to also acknowledge the Yuggera and the Turrbal people whose lands I'm working from today, and my respect to elders past, present and emerging. Just the only thing I'd say about our submission is keep an eye on it, because we've still got a week to go and we'll be adding to it. We'll be scouring our other submissions that we've done over the years, some to the recent housing summit, some to the first stage of the tenancy law review, to see if there's any additional topics that we think need to be included, but also maybe to bolster the things that we've already talked about in the current submission. So we'll keep that up to date on our website. So the link should remain current until we submit at 5 o'clock next Monday. Thanks.
Wonderful. Thank you, Penny. And certainly I think the number of unique and quality submissions is a really important factor here. We're really encouraging people to make submissions as much as they can. We'll talk in a second about some of the ways you can engage with the reforms, because there are other channels, but we're certainly promoting the submissions as a way to really have a unique voice. There'll be resources available from Tenants Queensland and QCOSS that you can use to populate some of those submissions. But in all submissions processes that I've been a part of, those quality and unique submissions really do make a difference in terms of getting a collective voice there and making our voices heard. And so we've got the summary of the key areas there, but the link's in the chat. So I really encourage you all to have a click on that and a bit of a read as we talk through the next parts. I'm just going to give a quick summary of where we've come from. So this has been a process for several years in terms of the reforms to tenancy legislation. So in 2018, the Open Doors to Renting reform was launched. There were about 137,000 responses to that process. And that's where the department did take the approach of having a survey online and kind of, I guess, opening up some different channels of feedback. In 2019, they released the Better Renting Future Reform Roadmap, and that's where they started to structure the stage 1 and stage 2 processes to kind of break down the different priority areas that they were looking at for reform. Stage 1, the priority areas were ending leases fairly, minimum housing standards, domestic and family violence protections, renting with pets, and minor modifications. So I'll touch on those quite briefly, but I'm mindful to use most of the time today to talk about stage 2. Penny, jump in if I'm missing anything there. It all feels like a long time ago, all kind of pre-COVID when we were advocating for these changes back then. So I just wanted to summarise the timing and the changes that had been previously announced. So domestic and family violence protections came in October 2021. And I guess trying to support people who were experiencing domestic and family violence in being able to leave properties, not being liable for damages, making modifications like changing the locks and making things easier for them to access given the situation and the crisis that they may be experiencing. Then ending tenancies fairly came in October last year. So there was the removal of without grounds evictions, which was quite a big part of the ask of Make Renting Fair Queensland. So that was very welcomed. There was an introduction of new grounds for property owners to end tenancies, and we'll touch a bit on that in a little bit as well, because that's certainly a strong ask for all of us in this current round. In terms of just some of those ways that people can have secure and safe leases and not have the rug pulled out of them without much notice. Renting with pets also had some changes coming in. I think that was the one that probably seemed to grab the public's eye as much as possible. I guess cute dogs and cats can do that, but it was changes around what's considered reasonable to refuse people to have pets there, and some of the conditions around allowing pets. And then there was also a phase of minimum housing standards. So that was announced in 2022. It applies to new leases from September this year and will apply to all tenancies from September next year. So they're phasing that into the tenancies and leases. So this is around minimum housing standards. This was something that was certainly an ask of previous campaigns. We'll touch on later in this conversation about minimum energy efficiency standards, which were not included. And that's certainly something we've been advocating for a while. But there's a list there that I won't run through, but I think a minimum bar for what's considered a reasonable property to be leased. I don't think there's anything there that would drastically surprise anyone. I think that's all pretty expected from many tenancies. So good to have that foundation there. But I think certainly from my perspective that there's more that can be done to raise that bar. So they were the main reforms and changes. I'm mindful I've flown through that very quickly, but I'm assuming everyone's pretty comfortable with that. Penny, I'll check with you if there's anything you wanted to discuss before we move forward?
I'll just add minor modifications to properties were originally on stage 1 reform agenda, but they got delayed. The government chose to remove them from stage 1 and put them into stage 2, and that's why you'll see them come up in the next bit that we talk about, because they're in the discussion paper now. And when we talk about that, Ryan, I might make some comments about the end of tenancies, or would you like me to do that now?
Yeah, sure. I think go for it now, and then we can loop back.
Yeah, so just going back to stage 1, we had the Open Doors paper came out at the end of 2018. Then the government issued a regulatory impact statement with their proposed changes in the end of 2019. And of course, COVID hit in the February, March of 2020. So everything went on hold. We had some COVID changes to tenancy laws under the emergency legislation, or the regulations under the legislation. And then we sort of exited out of those gradually from September 2021. And we had a bill introduced in 2022, which resulted in most changes taking effect in October last year. So originally, with the ending of tenancies, the government was intending to completely remove without ground notices to leave. They had what we call a just cause, which means every tenancy termination needs a just cause to be enacted. And our argument was that to do that, you actually do need to add some more reasons to end a tenancy, because in the Australian housing system, you might say it's legitimate if an owner wants to end a tenancy because they themselves or their immediate family want to move into the property, or it's going to have a change of purpose and removed from the rental market for a period of time, or needs significant repair and renovation that will require vacant possession for a period of time. So we supported the inclusion of new grounds to end tenancies. But at the very last moment, or not the very last moment, but the very last stage of tenancy law reforms, the government added in end of a fixed term into a reason to end a tenancy. And that is just the same as a no ground reason to end a tenancy. So that still presents problems for people because they're too worried to raise other issues about repairs and maintenance, or the rate the rent has increased for fear of loss of their tenancy when it can be ended just simply because the fixed term's coming to an end. And that's why we've got that matter. We're still going to push in our own submission to have the end of a fixed term removed as a reason to end a tenancy, simply because it should be a better reason than just because the fixed term's coming to an end. So thanks, Ryan.
Yeah, thank you, Penny. I think such an important point. I remember having conversations in that stage 1 process where there was a range of different rights for tenants that we were looking and advocating for and wanting to include. But I think the context of the power imbalance between a renter and their landlord means that if there is a way for tenancies to be ended by the landlord at relatively short notice, then it does really, it's an enormous disincentive for any renter to be advocating for their rights and really pushing for anything, whether it's reasonable repairs or anything that's slightly involving a bit of give and take with the landlord. If that fear is there that the tenancy could end, and certainly working in the sector, I met lots of different people that had that experience of having their tenancies end rather than the landlord addressing any of the issues. So I think it's it really sits under all of the other reforms and rights that we discuss here, and an important one that just is in the mix across all of the different areas we touch on. Okie dokie. So I'll move us on to stage 2 now. Again, mindful this is all pretty quick, but we don't have a huge amount of time. Please do chuck any questions or comments in the Q&A or into the chat, and we'll do our best to address those. I guess I just wanted to touch on the ways to participate in stage 2 reforms. So we're really promoting for everyone to make a written submission that does have a lot of value, and in scale, we can really start to do that together. There is an online survey to complete that also goes into the mix and has a voice. However, there's less scope there for you to really advocate for issues that may not be in the survey. You can send a letter to your local MP. If you go to the Make Renting Fair website, which we'll share a link in the chat for, you can send a written letter there to your local MP. And that's another really powerful way to get the scale of our sector in advocating for the changes we're looking for.
Sorry to interrupt you, but just to add to that, until submissions close at 5 o'clock on Monday next week, those MP letters are also being CC'd to the submission process as a submission. So particularly good for people with limited time or to share with clients and people that you're working with.
Yeah, fantastic. And then we really encourage everyone to promote through your networks as well. We do, like Penny said, have until 5 o'clock next Monday. So time is ticking, but the more we can really spread the word and get more out there, the better. Jackson, I see you've got a question in the chat about the fixed term discussion we just had. I might just put a pin in that until we come back and we're kind of unpacking that a bit more, if you bear with me. Sorry, mate.
And Ryan, just to add to the previous slide, the other thing I wanted to make a point about is if you do the online survey, because there's surveys for tenants and landlords, and I'm not sure if there's a third option, but those surveys are very restrictive. So you can only comment, I mean, they go into a bit of detail, but they only allow you to comment on the topics that are in the discussion paper. And that's why trying to do a submission that if you're concerned about how much rent is being able to be increased at the moment, because we've got no limits on that, and the end of tenancy for the end of a fixed term, if there's any other issues that you're concerned about and you want to put in the submission, you really need to write a submission. And the link that was just shared before by Lauren sets out our own submission, and I think Ryan and QCOSS will have theirs up soon too. We're going to keep that link up to date. So that's got a couple of those extra bits in. If you were really time poor, you could just cut and paste that out of the website, or I can send you a Word version. You can adjust it as you feel fit and just submit that through the email address by 5 p.m. 29th of May.
Yeah, wonderful. Thank you, Penny. I can see Nina's asked as well about sending letters to the Housing Minister and whether these will count as submissions too. So as Penny just touched on, if you use the Make Renting Fair website, Lauren, can I ask you to pop the link to that in the chat, please? That will CC to the submissions process as well up until 5 o'clock next Monday, 29th of May. So that'll act as a submission. And sorry, Nina, I can just see your question. What if we don't use the Make Renting Fair website? These ones go to MPs. I'm assuming you're asking if you're wanting to send your own letter to them. I think you can. Is it as simple as CCing in the Renting Queensland email address, Penny, to make a submission?
So I think Nina's question might be if they want to send letters to the Housing Minister, will they go into submissions too? And they're not using the Make Renting Fair website. I suspect like you'll need to use the submission email address to make it go in as a submission. So you could just send it jointly to those people, and I'll CC one or the other too.
Yeah, if it goes to that submission email address, and we'll make sure that gets sent out with our post-event email, so you know where to go. But if it goes to that email, then we can go from there. Okie dokie. I'm just going to start us moving along through some of the options paper. I can see there's a question there as well that we'll ensure we get back to, but I just want to try and touch on some of the priority areas that are in the options paper, just to set the frame of our discussion. And then there are a few different elements as well that are not referenced in the options paper that certainly Tenants Queensland, ourselves, and the Make Renting Fair campaign see as priority areas as well. So the priority areas in the options paper are around installing modifications, making minor personalizations, privacy and access, improving rental bond processes, and fairer fees and charges. And so the format of the paper essentially has 3 tiers of different reforms or suggested reforms in different priority areas. They're not necessarily linear. It is kind of option 1, 2, 3, and you'll see a bit of a theme of how they increase their level of reform, but it's not quite as straightforward as that. So we'll kind of unpack that a little bit as we go. We're going to talk through those 5 areas and the considerations and what's being discussed in the options paper as part of the reforms. And then we'll go on to the other areas as well, particularly around rental increases, energy efficiency, and some of the other considerations not in the options paper. So we're going to start with installing modifications. So the options paper breaks that down as status quo and education. You're going to hear that as a bit of a theme. Then option 2 is around guiding discretion, and option 3 is limiting discretion. The key considerations they're talking about here is around the permission for modifications. And the option 3, the limited discretion changes, they could include changes around accessibility in terms of modifications to be able to access your home, if there's mobility issues or anything along those lines. Security measures, so in terms of locks for windows, doors, these kinds of things. Childproofing, whether it's gates through the window latches and beyond, and securing furniture. They're the main things touched on there in the options paper. Penny, did you want to kick us off with any thoughts or discussion about installing modifications?
Yeah, I mean, I won't speak to how important they are, because they're important for safety. There's been children who've died in rental properties after a failure for permission to secure furniture to a wall. And so the safety and accessibility modifications are particularly important. And the key difference between option 2 and 3 is that if the change is denied, it's in option 2, it's the tenant that has to dispute it, and in option 3, it's the landlord that has to dispute it. And I guess we really support the idea that you express which are the types of changes that don't require prior permission, and we support the idea that the landlord has to challenge the change if it's not agreed to. The thing we didn't support in the paper is it gives a long time for people to dispute it. So there's 14 days after a tenant notifies that they intend to make a change for a notification back to say there's going to be a dispute. And then following that 14 days, there's another 28 days to apply to the tribunal by whichever party it is, if it's the landlord, then to apply to the tribunal to dispute the change. And then there'll be the wait time between the application and the hearing. And if you're a person who needs accessibility changes or safety changes, that's potentially 6 weeks just waiting time on the dispute to even be lodged in the tribunal, and then a wait time in the tribunal. And we think, that could be really reduced to like 7 days and 7 days, or 7 days and 7 days is what we advocated for, or 7 days and 14 days might be reasonable, but not 6 weeks.
Thank you for that, Penny. Yeah, absolutely. I think those timeframes in terms of the impact they can have to people's lives is really important. I know for those interested, I don't have the links at hand, but I know QDN was leading a bit of work around some of the modifications for mobility and accessibility towards the end of last year. I think they ran a few workshops around that. And so as the peak in their sector, a really important voice for people with disability.
Ryan, just to add one thing about this topic, there is set out in the paper a suggestion that the changes, I think it might be in option 2, but I'm not 100% sure about that. But I think it expresses that if the changes are made, then the tenant might be required to use a tradesperson or a professional. And our position about that is that that shouldn't be more onerous on renters than it is on other people like landlords and homeowners. Because there are some things that you require a tradesperson for, so expenditures over a certain amount, or things that electrical changes and things like that. So where there's already a requirement, we're on board with that. But tenants are still going to be responsible to restore the property. And so we don't think it's reasonable to impose an additional level of requirement on renters to make the changes than would be otherwise applied to the landlord themselves or an owner occupier.
Yeah, absolutely agree there. I think it's always tricky with these things where it's quite a big topic in terms of modifications. But if we're talking about a little rail to stop kids falling down the stairs, getting a tradesperson does seem somewhat ludicrous. So folks, feel free to chuck in questions about any of the topics as we go. We're just going to kind of touch on each and have a bit of a conversation, but can loop back to it. I can see there's a question in there about the impact of tenants' rights on investors that I'm just going to save to the end as well. I'm going to move us along to minor personalizations. So again, you'll see a bit of a similar structure in terms of the three options around status quo plus education, guiding discretion and limiting discretion. So the key considerations that the paper is discussing here are around permission for personalizations. And when they talk through limited discretion, the changes could include hanging picture frames, organizing internet connections and phone line connections. Although I think that's becoming less common. Plants and vegetation, and how that can be managed in terms of herb gardens, veggie gardens and such things. And changes that don't permanently alter surfaces, so anything that doesn't have a permanent structural change to the property. Penny, are you right to talk through your thoughts on minor personalizations?
Yeah. We've taken a very similar view with personalisation to what we have with safety and accessibility minor modifications, that we support that the things within scope of a tenant to be able to change without permission should be expressed in the laws and the tenancy laws, and disputes should be taken forward by the landlord rather than the tenant to the tribunal. And yeah, that's pretty much our position. And the other issue with this one is the same time frame. So the time frames that are the same, set out to dispute a matter, 14 days from the time you're notified, and then 28 days to apply to the tribunal after you're notified of a dispute. So that just seems way too long to us as well, because by the time you get there, if you're on a 6-month agreement, you might come to the end of that.
Mm-hmm. Excellent, thank you. I'll move us along to privacy and access. I found this one probably the hardest to try and summarize into one slide in terms of the options breakdown: status quo plus education. Option 2 is called balancing access and privacy, and option 3 is called limit intrusion. So they're really talking here about tenants' privacy and quiet enjoyment of their tenancy, the frequency and purpose of entry from the landlord to the property, and the notice periods and the information provided to the tenants in terms of those timeframes and processes. The limit intrusion changes could include, I've just tried to summarize, I guess, the themes here rather than the details that we can talk to, but around data information and privacy, inspection frequency, purpose and notice periods, like I just touched on, the use of virtual inspections as a alternative, and photographs and videos of properties. So a lot around, I guess, the privacy that the tenants have to their home, and what's considered reasonable, I guess, in terms of the landlord being able to enter the property, how long they give people the notice to prepare, and things like whether the tenants are able to be on site, and particularly around some of the recording things that have a real tension with privacy and the right to someone's home. Penny, what are your thoughts?
So this is one where option 3 does provide a bit more, it includes more topics than option 2 does. I've sort of dismissed option 1 and the status quo option in all of these, because we think we need change, we need improvements. So status quo is really about maintaining the same laws, but just informing people about them better. So in both options, option 2 and 3 under privacy and access, there is proposals to change the frequency of entries and the time periods required for most entries to be given to the tenant. So both options provide, if the tenant allows a non-physical entry, so does a virtual entry, like doing a photos or whatever, or a video in the tenancy, that the entries could then be at least the physical entries by the landlord or agent would be once a year rather than once every 3 months, which is what they require now. So they reduce those entries to once every 6 months. But one of those, if it's a virtual entry, there's only one physical entry allowed then. The notice periods for all entries that are 24 hours. So these are things like repairs, valuations, very common sort of entry notice periods. There's proposals to change them in option 2 from 24 hours to 48 hours and in option 3 from 24 hours to 72 hours. And you may or may not know that when an a notice period is expressed in hours, once that's delivered, the time period starts ticking from then. But when it's expressed in days or months, it doesn't start ticking until you would expect it to have been received. And so there's like time periods for that. So we do find people get an entry notice in their letterbox because they're also to show prospective tenants and to show a place to prospective tenants and purchasers. They get it in their letterbox and the time starts ticking when it goes in the letterbox, but they might not check the letterbox, or they might not check it, or they've already checked it for the day if they're going to check it. So before they know it, the entry is happening for them. The general inspection notice periods under option 3 are proposed. Option 2, they're extended to 7 days, whereas in option 3 they're extended to 10 working days, so that's 2 weeks. There are 7 days now, actually. Sorry, so there's no change in option 2 to that. And the thing in option 3, that in both options there is a proposal to extend an entry notice for a prospective purchaser to do entries for a couple of things, a pre-settlement inspection, I think they're calling it, and one other thing, I can't see it off the top of my head, but we don't think that they're required because there's already entry period. There are already entry notices for people who are selling a property to enter and show a prospective purchaser. So we've opposed that in our submission. There's also in option 3 some conversation and proposed changes around the information that can be requested of a prospective tenant when they're applying for properties. And we do think that they're important changes, and they're changes that have already happened in some other states. So Victoria brought these laws in about late 2018. So it would restrict questions on applications that are about whether you've ever had any dispute about a tenancy before, so you've ever been to a tribunal about a tenancy matter, how your previous bonds were dispersed, financial statements that show all your transactions, so aren't just about showing that you can afford a property by showing you've got an income, but are about showing financial statements, and anything that's already a protected attribute under the Anti-Discrimination Act. So we would really support those changes. There are a couple of other things related to applications as well, and also how information has to be stored about tenants when it's collected, because there's an awful lot of information being provided by prospective tenants, and some of them aren't even seeing the properties that they're providing information for. So there's also proposals to give tenants choice about whether to submit a rental application in a hard copy or via email, whether they provide a site of access to their documentation to prove their ID rather than provided in a soft copy or a hard copy, but they just show it to the other person. Yeah, that's pretty much. I think there's also just storing information if the application information isn't used. So I think they're really important matters that are really current now, and they're expressed in option 3. And I think we should probably support protecting all of those prospective tenants' privacy out there. And even if you don't sort of support option 3, you might want to add that as, whatever your position is. We haven't really nominated which option we're supporting. We're just pulling out the bits from each of the options that we think are useful and helpful and putting those into our submission to support or oppose as it might be.
Yeah, thank you, Penny. I think there's a question in there that I think touches on that storage of data and information. Someone's asked about the agent or lessor obligations in relation to client confidentiality and data security. So that's certainly in our asks around how that's done properly in a way that maintains security and privacy. And certainly that's, yeah, I think more of a conversation at the moment than it would have been in previous years.
Just on that topic, Ryan, what the paper says in option 3 is rental property owners and managers must ensure information collected from prospective renters through the application process is securely stored and or destroyed and accessed only for the purpose of assessing tenancy suitability by the owner or their agent unless the renter otherwise agrees. So that's in option 3. The one downside of these proposals, and it's set out definitely in option 3, it talks about, it's in option 3 actually, it talks about entry and it seems to imply there would be people would be allowed to enter the property to take photos for the sale of property, and those photos could include, it seems to imply this, it doesn't explicitly say it, they could include pictures of the tenant's goods. There's exclusions to that, so not if they would identify the person or if they're a value that person would be worried about being broken into. But that would be, at the moment, people can't do that. They can, by agreement, take photographs and use them for advertising if the tenant agrees to that. But otherwise, they can't take photos and use them to advertise if they've got tenants' goods in them. They might come in and take photos to show the property to the landlord if they're living interstate or something. I think they're quite concerning, those proposals, because they're quite convoluted. So they allow it, they seem to allow it, they give exceptions to it, and then they set out a dispute process. And it just seems that tenants should be able to have a right of not having their goods shown to people as advertising for a property.
Absolutely, absolutely agree. I'm going to move us along, just mindful of time, onto the improving rental bond process. So again, the options paper has 3 options there. Number 1, status quo plus education. Number 2, require bond claims to be substantiated. And number 3 is require bond claims and renters' liability to claims to be proven. So the key considerations here are the bond processes. Now, I think even option 3 discusses keeping the bond process as it is, but it talks around the different levels around substantiating or proving claims to holding the bond or at the end of the tenancy. So the potential changes could include the proof of claims and the evidence of the renter's liability to that claim, and the protection of the rentist interest in the bond refund. So there's a lot here just around making that bond process a fairer experience for renters, and the obligations on the lessor or landlord around any claims they're making to keeping any of the bond payment. Penny, any thoughts or comments to discuss from TQ's perspective for that one?
Yeah, this is a key issue for us because a bond is like nothing else. You pay it. It's not a deposit on a transactional cost. It's just held in trust in case something's wrong at the end of the tenancy. So it's not like when you purchase a property and you give a deposit and that's then part of your purchase, transaction. So it's clearly the tenant's money that's been held in trust. And what happens at the moment is when the tenancy ends, and you probably, many people on this webinar will know already, it's a race to apply for the bond, because if you're the one that gets you have to first go to the RTA to make a claim on the bond before you can get to the tribunal. If you're the first one to ask for the bond with the Residential Tenancies Authority, the process is going to be slightly easier for you along the way. And as consumers, tenants are much less likely to have that information about the process than landlords and agents who are delivering, they're in business to deliver this, to get, to manage properties and bonds. So we don't think it's fair that a tenant should ever end up in the tribunal as an applicant for their bond. It should always be the tenant who is a respondent to it, because that means they'll have seen the application in QCAT. and they know what the claims are that they have to respond to. Whereas sometimes at the moment what's happening is they have to go to the tribunal and they've got very tight timeframes to get in there, and they have to think what that might be the claim so that they can be ready on the day to oppose them. We just don't think that's fair. It's a tenant's money. If there's a claim on it, then it should be brought forward by the other party with their evidence. And it's not completely clear to me in the paper whether that change is being proposed, because on one hand, the paper says evidence needs to be brought forward about the claims against the bond, but on the other hand, it says we're keeping the same bond return process. So we're really going to draw that issue out about tenants. It should be always the claim against the tenant, not the tenant trying to get their own bond back.
Yeah, absolutely agree. And I think it's such an important part in terms of that transition for a tenant and moving into a new property, and it's just such a challenging time, I think, even if all runs smoothly. And
sorry, Ryan, you just remind me of another topic. I'm sorry, I'll be quick. But one thing we're going to put, we haven't got it in the paper online yet, but we will be adding to it. It's something we put up at the summit, the housing summit, that we would like to see this a sort of bond certificate process. Right now, if you have a bond and you're moving to a new property, you can transfer that bond with the RTA by filling in some forms. We'd like to see that process occur even if there's a dispute. So you might have sort of a bond certificate that's transferred to the new property until the bond dispute is settled on the previous property. And if there is an amount owed, the rest of the bond is transferred to the new property. Oh, that would already have occurred if there's not a claim on it. But the rest of the money is made up by the tenant over a period of time. Because people's bonds these days are thousands and thousands of dollars, and they simply can't afford to have two bonds. So we think some sort of bond certificate process. We'll pull that out of our housing summit paper and we'll stick it into the submission we've made.
Yeah, fantastic. A very good point, Penny. Thank you. I'm going to keep ticking us along again, being the painful timekeeper. So the final option in the paper, and then I'm keen to get to the conversation about the additional areas as well. Noticing I'll try and find a way to jump to energetic communities. I'll give you a chance to try and talk as well when we get to the energy efficiency. So I've seen your question, and we'll get there in a moment. So fairer fees and charges is the last priority area in the options paper. The breakdown again around 3 options, number 2 being increased transparency, and number 3 being limiting fees and charges. So the key considerations here are around rental payment method fees. Option 3 explicitly discusses around having an option that does not have a fee for you to make rental payments, which seems like a very straightforward thing that we should have for people. Service charges and timeframes around some of the consumption there of utilities, and particularly around water charges. Reletting costs, so if you are ending your tenancy, around the charges that can be passed on to tenants to relet the property. And the option 3 proposes a progressive reletting system, so a figure based on how much of the tenancy is left, so that if it's right at the start of the tenancy and you're looking to end, the reletting fees are higher, and as you get closer to the end of your tenancy or the fixed term date, the reletting fees are lower, as a balance of how that impacts the process. I think this is another really important area, and one that certainly in my experience anecdotally in my personal life, and even in supporting people in the sector, there's quite a variance in practice, and quite a variance in people's understanding of what should or shouldn't be happening. And certainly I think even just recently hearing stories of people being asked for compensation after having to end a tenancy due to the proposed rent increases on that property that forced them out of it in the first place. So quite a contentious, I think, part of the process, particularly where the market is at the moment with rental increases being so high. And it may be a segue into rent increases as the next conversation point after the options paper part. Penny, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, so the 2 options, option 2 and 3, are quite similar. The only difference with option 3 is it also includes that renters may only be required to pay for excessive consumption charges above what would be considered reasonable consumption for a comparative household. This was what used to happen with water charges, for example, before we had changes some years ago. So every household would have to be supplied with a reasonable quantity of water, and that's always subject to how many people live there, if they've got a pool, a garden to maintain, all those sort of things. So it's really returning in a more broad sense, not just water, but if you have consumption charges for anything. So we'll support that. But more broadly, though, we do support the idea that there's reletting costs that are set out in the Act. This has happened in other states. It's happened in New South Wales, and I'm pretty sure it's happened in Victoria as well. But those amounts that are in there, in using a theory like that, that's how we would now argue for a relet cost if we had to go to the tribunal. Because the less time you've got to left on the tenancy, the theory is you're not causing these costs to the landlord. You're bringing them forward by a short period of time, because the landlord would always have a let cost when they have a new tenant start. So if you're only leaving 2 weeks earlier, you're just bringing those costs to the landlord forward, and you probably shouldn't do anything really. So I think setting them out in law would save QCOSS a lot of time. And in fact, the overlay of that is because people have multiple fixed term agreements usually. If you're on your third one, you'd actually think that you might not have to pay a relet cost because you've already saved them the 2 let costs of the previous agreement. So I think it's kind of fair, reasonable. It will save QCOSS a lot of time to be able to define what reasonable reletting costs are. And the other one thing in this section, which I think we'll all agree on, it's been an issue kicking around for ages, is bringing forward any costs that a tenant has. So, for example, water charges. There's currently no requirement to bring those invoices to a tenant within a reasonable time. So some tenants, because it's actually a debt, it's not a breach of agreement under the tenancy laws, it's got a 6-year limitation period. So tenants sometimes are in their properties for years, and then they get all of these water charges at the end of it that they've got to pay. So this would require them under option 2 and 3 to bring any of those required fees forward within a month of the lessor getting the bill.
Thank you, Penny. Okie dokie.
The big omission in this section is rent that you've just flagged, Ryan. Before we started the whole process and split it into 2, when we did split the process into 2, stage 1 and stage 2, rent was one of the topics for stage 2, as was bond. And we were expecting there to be a more robust conversation about rent. There's a proposal to have a fee-free way of paying rent, which is great. But the really big missing bit is, should we limit the amount rents can go up? And you may have seen this happen in the media. We did see the Premier come out just before the Housing Roundtable earlier in the year. And she said we might be looking at how rents can be rent caps. In fact, she used the word rent caps. But within a fairly quick period of time, that got sort of changed to what ended up happening, which was to limit the number of times rent can be increased in a year from once every 6 months to once a year, which is important as well, and it does align with other states. But from our perspective, that's not enough. And we're seeing just very high rent increases, people facing 23% rent increases on average when they're contacting our service. So some are having much, much larger ones than that. And we think if we were to limit it to the CPI as a maximum once per year, you maintain the returns to investors, but you also give people some stability and some predictability about their rent increases over time. We do a similar thing about land tax. You look at how much it's gone up over the last 2 years to estimate, so you're protecting people from bill shock by averaging out the increases. So it's a similar sort of thing where you just allow a moderate increase over time rather than these sort of big increases because of the state of the market.
Absolutely. I think that's always been, a relatively contentious area around that market intervention. And I know from memory, the legislation has no restriction. It's whatever the market will bear, I think is the language, which, seeing what the market's been over the last year or two has been such a dramatic shift from what we've seen previously of what would be considered reasonable. And I think in terms of the context of where we are now, it's a very different space. And yeah, I think Penny summarised that well in terms of what we were asking for around limits to rent increases, and certainly around the amount of rent increase, not just the frequency, because that, yeah, the frequency is important, but obviously that the amount is making a huge difference. And certainly we're seeing that across Queensland in terms of the impact of dramatic rent increases that are forcing people out of their homes. So I can see there was a question there a little bit earlier. Sorry, I'm not sure if you answered to it there, Penny, about the advertising costs, and when we're talking about reletting fees, which I think is bundled into what they're discussing there around what should be fair charges.
Yeah, so any costs about reletting the property would be included in what's in the paper. So advertising the week's rent that the agent normally gets to find a tenant and any loss of rent. That'd all be included in what would then be enact as the reasonable reletting costs.
Thank you, Penny. And so, yeah, back to rent increases. Certainly, that's the position of the Make Renting Fair campaign around limiting it to CPI once a year, as a way to peg it to what would be reasonable around covering the costs to landlords, but keeping it capped within a reasonable amount. I'm sure that'll be a contentious part of this whole process through the process.
But just to let people know, there's a similar thing that's currently in law in the ACT in tenancy laws. It defines excessive rent increases to be those over 10% above the CPI, so 110% of CPI. And if they're over that, then the landlord has to justify them. And that's also our position. There may be some circumstances where an over CPI increase is reasonable, and that might be because significant amenity has been provided in the property, renovate the kitchen or something that's not just about repair and maintenance, because that's already an obligation, but actually significantly adds to the amenity of the property. And if that's the case, the landlord could argue for a greater increase.
Absolutely. Now, mindful of time here, folks, those eagle-eyed of you would have seen how the sausage is made with Lauren and I chatting about some of the energy efficiency discussions. I just want to loop back to the first question from Jackson around, he's asked Penny around suggesting the phrasing of wording around the end of a fixed term being removed. Is there some layman's language or examples or resources from Tenants Queensland around that part of it? Sorry to be changing gears so much, and then I'll move to energy efficiency after that.
So we've got in our submission, it's online at the moment. We've added just a paragraph in there that you could use, cut and paste if you want. And I guess it's really just about asking for the end of a fixed term in inverted commas to be removed as a reason to end a tenancy in Queensland tenancy laws. Yeah.
Thank you, Penny. Now, so we have been chatting in the Teams chat just to see if we can encourage our colleagues from energetic communities to talk to the energy efficiency minimum standards. So I'm not sure if we have Deanna, Luke, one or both of you. I'm going to try and allow you to talk. You should be able to join us in the conversation here. I thought we'd throw to you. I know you've got some resources we can share, but you know, certainly tip my hat to yourselves as experts in the space of energy efficiency in this part of the conversation.
Thanks very much, Ryan. Yeah, we very much support all of Tenants Queensland's full list of things Penny was saying, but I just thought I'd jump in to add a bit more detail about energy efficiency for anyone who wants to understand that a bit more. So that's about making the home, looking at things that add to people's health and well-being, making sure the house doesn't get too freezing cold, too boiling hot during the day, and also help the flow of people's energy use, things like ceiling insulation, looking at the star rating of fixed appliances that are fixtures in the home, so things like that. So having minimum standards for these things will mean that homes are more affordable because the energy costs go down, and also safer for people where they're not in heat stress or heat cold. And these are also standards that we can ask for in Queensland, and some minimum standards have been brought in other states around Australia, and also in Penny was comparing Europe, how the rental caps are much better. Also, energy efficiency is much better in other parts of the world. So that's something else that we can ask for in Queensland. And so I put a link in for full details, but also energeticcommunities.org.au for more information. And Tenants Queensland has some wording on there about energy efficiency as well, but I just thought I'd jump in to add a little bit more detail on that.
Wonderful. Thank you kindly. I think I know yourself and Luke and a whole bunch of amazing people have been really advocating for this for a long time around the different frameworks that can be used, using examples from other jurisdictions, particularly Europe, around some of their rating systems. And an important part when we're talking about cost of living, use of resources, environmental impacts, it's just a really important part of the whole conversation, and it is absent from the options paper. So we just wanted to make sure that we could flag that there, and we'll certainly share the resources and options around that as we go. So I am mindful that we have 3 minutes left. So I wanted to check, Penny, there's a few other considerations here that we've discussed that QCOSS will certainly be touching on. I know Tenants Queensland has included. Is there anything in the next minute or so that you really wanted to flag there before I move us to our call to action?
No. We did get a question about investors, and we've done research on this, and all of the research, and we've looked at research over the years. So we did desktop research and all the research, and what the research says is that tenancy law has little or no impact on investors. Mm-hmm. What they're more motivated about is financial and monetary policy, things like interest rates, whether it's at the height of the market, they want to sell out to, or they think, and investors come in and out of the market all the time based on things that are happening for them. They might be ill, they might need to capitalise their investment, might be the top of the market. So the research doesn't support the idea that tenancy law changes will change it. In fact, Australia has very weak tenancy law compared to other countries. Canada has very similar housing system to us, similar percentages of people in different tenures, and they have rent caps there in most of their provinces. So the other thing is that investors are largely buying existing properties, so they're not adding to the stock. They're just competing with people for the existing properties. So it's easy to say, but it's not easy to show in research that it's going to have an impact on investors. Yeah,
certainly. I think everyone's going to hear that argument in this conversation publicly over the next little while, but it's certainly, from what I've been able to read, is not a strong argument backed by evidence, for all the reasons that Penny just said there. But I'm sure it's a narrative that will get bandied around, and that's probably a nice little segue in terms of what you can do, both those with us today and those who may be watching this in the future as it's recorded. Really sharing the opportunity to make these submissions. I think there's a lot here to discuss and a lot that's really important that's going to make a big impact on people's lives. But we're really advocating for yourselves to participate in the process and to promote through your networks, to talk to your friends, to talk to your colleagues, particularly because the strength of some of those narratives, such as the one we just touched on around investors, those conversations are quite publicly had, and they're difficult narratives to go away. So we really need to have a strong voice in terms of what we're advocating for, and that's a very collective effort. We need everyone to be working together, and I think we've seen, I've had the privilege at QCOSS here to see countless times that the community sector can have an amazing amount of strength together, and this is an opportunity, I think, to have that collective voice, to really advocate for the people who are renting and the impacts this can have. So we've got some call to action, some ways you can get involved there. The main one we're really pushing is to complete a unique submission, but there is the survey, there is the opportunity to send a letter through the Make Renting Fair website, which then is a submission as well. And we've discussed the email there as well. And to sign up to the campaign and participate and promote. We'll be sending from here and a follow-up email to you all with some of the links and resources we discussed, as well as a reference to what's on the screen there now, as a way to call to action with the week we have left. So submissions do close on Monday, the 29th of May at 5 p.m. And as I've said a few times, it's vitally important that we all do what we can with the time we have left to promote and engage with the process, so that we get some really rich content going in there to inform this decision. Penny, I want to thank you so deeply for joining us here today. It's such a privilege to be sharing the screen with you, and always a great honour to be partnering between our great organisations. Do you have any final words you'd like to share before we give people their day back?
Look, just please raise your voice to get better tenancy laws to protect our renters across the state, because we really need the support. Renters themselves are actually quite scared about doing these sort of things, so the more organisations. And thank you to QCOSS for partnering with us. It's been great.
Always a pleasure. So everyone, get amongst it. We'll send some content out, but we really encourage you to participate. And I want to thank you all for your time and everything that you do. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.